On a quiet night in Tucson, Arizona, something happened that would leave investigators puzzled for months. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman known by neighbors as kind and gentle, disappeared from her home without a trace. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where people rarely lock their doors before going to bed. But shortly after midnight, a shadow appeared on Nancy's front porch. Her doorbell camera captured only a brief moment. A masked figure. The person stood still for a few seconds, looking directly at the door. Then the camera suddenly went dark. At first, investigators believed the device had simply malfunctioned, but the timing raised serious questions. The camera stopped recording only seconds after the masked individual appeared. What happened next made the situation even more disturbing. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker that transmitted a monitoring signal.
Doctors later confirmed that the signal stopped shortly after the camera shut off. That meant something serious had happened inside the house. When neighbors realized Nancy was missing the next morning, police quickly arrived at the scene. The front door was slightly open, and there were small blood droplets on the porch. Inside the house, investigators found signs that a struggle may have taken place, but Nancy herself was gone. No vehicle was seen leaving the neighborhood. No witnesses heard screams, and the masked figure captured by the doorbell camera remained unidentified. Detectives initially believed they were dealing with a carefully planned kidnapping, but the investigation quickly stalled. There were no fingerprints, no obvious suspects, and the masked person had left almost nothing behind. For weeks, the case looked impossible to solve. Then, miles away from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators discovered something that would change the entire investigation. A single glove. At first glance, it looked like just another discarded item on the roadside. But inside that glove was something criminals fear more than anything else: DNA. And that small trace of genetic evidence would soon send detectives down a path that could finally expose the identity of the masked figure seen on Nancy Guthrie's porch.
The discovery of the glove seemed almost accidental. A search team was reviewing areas several miles away from Nancy Guthrie's home when one investigator noticed the object lying near the edge of the road. It looked ordinary, a black glove, slightly worn and covered with dust. At first, detectives weren't even sure it was related to the case. Items like that are often found near crime scenes and usually have no connection to the investigation. But something about this glove caught their attention. When forensic analysts compared it with the footage from Nancy's doorbell camera, they noticed something striking. The masked figure standing on the porch appeared to be wearing gloves. Not only that, but the shape and stitching looked similar. That was enough for investigators to send the glove to a laboratory for detailed testing. Inside the lab, forensic specialists carefully examined the fabric.
And that's when they made an important discovery. Hidden within the fibers of the glove was a genetic profile, DNA from an unknown man. For detectives, this was the first real piece of evidence that could potentially identify the person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The DNA profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database. If the suspect had ever been arrested before, the system might produce a match. But when the results came back, investigators faced another disappointment. There were no matches. The person who left the DNA behind had likely never been arrested. For many investigations, that would have been the end of the trail. But technology had recently given detectives a new tool, one that had already solved some of the most famous cold cases in American history: genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for the suspect directly, investigators would search for the suspect's relatives, and that strategy would soon begin narrowing thousands of possibilities down to one single individual.
Genetic genealogy has completely transformed the way detectives investigate difficult cases. Rather than looking for an exact match in criminal databases, investigators search public genealogy databases used by millions of people researching their ancestry. These databases contain DNA profiles submitted voluntarily by individuals who want to learn more about their family history. But when detectives analyze the data, they are not looking for the suspect, they are looking for relatives. Even distant relatives can provide critical clues. The process begins with the unknown DNA collected from the crime scene, in this case, the DNA recovered from the glove. That genetic profile is compared against the genealogy database. When partial matches appear, investigators begin constructing a massive family tree. At first, the connections are extremely distant: third cousins, fourth cousins, people who may not even know each other personally. But each connection provides investigators with something valuable: direction. From there,
Genealogists and detectives began tracing family lines forward through time. They analyzed birth records, marriage records, and public documents. Thousands of potential individuals slowly become hundreds. Hundreds become dozens, and eventually, only a small number remain. That is exactly what happened in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. When investigators began mapping the DNA connections, one branch of the family tree immediately stood out. Several members of that family had ties to Arizona, more specifically to the Tucson area. That discovery was impossible for detectives to ignore, because if the genetic trail was correct, it meant the masked figure outside Nancy Guthrie's home might not have been a random stranger. He might have been someone familiar with the area, someone who already knew the neighborhood. As investigators continued narrowing the family tree, one particular name began drawing more attention than the others: a man who had once lived close enough to Nancy Guthrie's home to know the area well. For the first time since Nancy disappeared, detectives believed they might finally be closing in on the person responsible. But genetic genealogy alone was not enough to prove anything. To confirm their suspicions, investigators needed one final piece of evidence: a direct DNA sample from the man they believed might be the masked figure. Once investigators identified the individual connected to the genetic family tree, the case entered a crucial phase: verification. Genetic genealogy can point detectives toward a potential suspect, but it cannot be used as the sole evidence in court. To confirm the connection, investigators needed a direct DNA comparison, but obtaining that DNA required patience. Detectives could not simply approach the suspect and demand a sample without legal justification. Instead, they relied on a method that has been used in many major criminal investigations: surveillance. Teams quietly began monitoring the suspect's daily routine. They watched where he went, they noted the places he visited, and most importantly, they waited for the moment when he discarded something containing DNA. Everyday objects can carry genetic material: a soda bottle, a coffee cup, a cigarette. Anything that touches a person's mouth can leave behind usable DNA. For investigators, recovering one of these items could provide the final answer. Days passed, then weeks. The suspect continued his normal routine, unaware that detectives were carefully observing every movement. Finally, the opportunity arrived. During routine surveillance, investigators saw the man throw away an item in a public trash container. Detectives quickly retrieved it after he left. The object was sealed as evidence and immediately sent to a forensic laboratory. Inside the lab, scientists extracted DNA from the discarded item. Then they began comparing it with a genetic profile recovered from the glove. The process required precision. Each genetic marker had to be analyzed carefully. Because of the two samples matched, detectives would finally have scientific proof connecting the suspect to the evidence found near Nancy Guthrie's home. For investigators waiting outside that laboratory, the tension was enormous. Everything now depended on the results of one DNA test.
When the laboratory results finally arrived, investigators immediately understood the significance. The DNA matched. The genetic profile extracted from the discarded item was identical to the DNA found inside the glove discovered near Nancy Guthrie's home. For detectives, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The man they had been watching was now officially connected to the physical evidence. But even with this discovery, many questions remained unanswered. Why had he been outside Nancy Guthrie's home? What happened during the 41 minutes between the moment the doorbell camera went dark and the moment Nancy's pacemaker signal stopped transmitting? Investigators began reviewing the evidence again. They studied the surveillance footage. They analyzed the small blood droplets found near the front door, and they reconstructed the timeline of events. Finally, after consulting with prosecutors and reviewing all available evidence, detectives made their move. The arrest happened quietly. Officers approached the suspect, informed him of the charges, and placed him into custody. For investigators who had spent months chasing fragments of evidence, the moment represented a major turning point. But solving a case is not only about identifying a suspect, it is about understanding the full story. Detectives still needed answers. What happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home that night? Was the crime planned from the beginning? Or did something unexpected happen that caused the situation to spiral out of control?
Those answers may lie within the mysterious 41-minute window between the disabled camera and the loss of Nancy's pacemaker signal. Somewhere within those minutes, the truth about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was written. And investigators believe that once the complete story is revealed, the mystery that began on that quiet night in Tucson may finally be solved. But one thing is already certain: a single piece of DNA exposed the man behind the mask.